too much.
Do you remember the time that Taylor Swift won that award at the Video Music Awards on MTV, and then Kanye West jumped up and ruined the entire moment with some bizarre speech about how somebody else should have won? It was one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever seen on live TV. And as Kanye went on giving his speech about true artistry and how Beyonce should have won this award, the time for Taylor's speech just kind of ticked away until eventually the producers queued up the music indicating that the time for the speech was over, and that was it. She didn't have a chance to say anything that she might have wanted to say to thank people or whatever people do at award shows when they win things. It was such a universally reviled chump move that even the President of the United States was caught on a hot mic criticizing Kanye a couple days after that happened. The story has a little bit of a pleasant ending because later on in the night, Beyonce wins an award and she jumps up there, and rather than giving her own speech, she calls Taylor Swift to come back up and gives her the mic, and Taylor Swift has the opportunity to thank the people she needs to thank in this really important moment in her young life. Putting it simply, what basically happened there is there was a beautiful moment for a young kid that got ruined by somebody for some bizarre, selfish reason, and then somebody else came along and tried to make the situation better. You're never going to see this coming, but the story I'm telling you actually relates to what we're going to be looking at in the Bible today. I know! In Acts chapter 4, Peter and John have just got done performing this out-of-the-blue miracle for a guy who was in a helpless situation. He can't walk, he has to get dragged to a place and dumped there to beg because he can't even drag himself there to beg. And along come these two dudes and they say, "We don't have any money for you, but we got something better." They tell him in the name of Jesus to get up and walk. And then the guy gets up and walks and celebrates, and everybody celebrates with him. And they want to know what the deal is, and so Peter gives this really cool speech about how God is gracious and forgiving. In the same way there's physical healing for this guy, he intones there is spiritual healing for you. And he calls people to think about Jesus differently than they had been thinking about him before. It's a great miracle where an individual receives a beautiful gift, and where everybody who's there to celebrate with him also has the opportunity to hear about something that is enormously, eternally true and has bearing on their lives, a message of grace and hope. But, just like in the story we were talking about with the Video Music Awards, somebody has to come along and be a turd about the whole thing. And in this case, it's a portion of the religious leadership. So they're going to come, they're going to interrupt this thing, they're going to break up the celebration, and they're going to put this nonsense about feeling better or whatnot to bed. This concludes the introductory portion of today's episode. At this time, I would be super grateful if you would take a moment, hit pause, and read Acts chapter 4, verses 1 through 22. And I'd also like to note that last episode, I asked you for feedback on whether or not you thought it would be cool for me to use a teleprompter. And at this time, I'd like to release the poll results on the feedback regarding that question. 4 of you said, "I didn't care for that and would prefer to have you just read out of the Bible in the future." 2 of you said, "I could live with it, but reading out of the Bible was better." 18 of you said that if I continue to read from the teleprompter, you'll unsubscribe, never watch the program again, and actively seek to sabotage me in the future. 4 of you told me about great opportunities to work from home and ways that I could make $4,000 a month, just like a single housewife in Detroit. It's real. And finally, 1 of you sent me a link to a place where I can learn one simple trick to get ripped fast. All told, by my calculations, that brings the total to 100% to 0% in favor of never, ever, ever, ever using a teleprompter again. So as we get ready to break down this passage, I think there are a couple of obvious questions that an attentive reader should be asking. Question number 1, is this going to turn out the same way for Peter that it did for Jesus? It looks like Peter is starting to get crossways with the same people who saw Jesus executed, and it makes sense to wonder if Peter's headed down a dangerous path. A second question, how will Peter and the disciples do in terms of moving forward with the church and the gospel now that they're facing serious resistance from the religious leaders, but they no longer have Jesus around in the flesh to bail them out whenever they don't know what to do? Verse 1, the priests and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. Now, as we're about to look at a text that is pretty critical of these guys, I want to make a point that I've made before and I'm going to make a few more times. When we are criticizing the Jewish leadership in the 1st century AD, we are not criticizing Jews. We're criticizing one group of guys. A whole bunch of Jewish people had responded to Jesus. A whole bunch of other Jewish people would not respond to Jesus, but would still interact peaceably and just kind of agree to see the thing differently. We're talking not about a general tendency for Jewish people or something racist. Ugh. Rather, we're talking about one group of spiritual leaders who were in a position to influence people the right way, who studied the scriptures and should have been dialed into this stuff, who should have recognized Jesus for who he was, and not only didn't recognize him for who he was, but went ahead and killed him. The Sadducees were the liberal spiritual political party of the day. Political parties and spiritual groups were kind of the same thing at this point in Jewish history. You had conservatives like the Pharisees who were very into rules and order and had a way that they believed things needed to be. They kind of tended to look backwards. You had Sadducees who believed that things needed further reformation and were skeptical about some of the supernatural elements involved in the religion they professed. At any rate, they roll up not just by themselves, but they bring the muscle. The temple guard comes with so that if anybody needs, beating for the greater good, they can dish that out. Verse 2. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. First century audience would have immediately known why this was offensive to the Sadducees. For us, we got to work a little bit harder and do some homework to understand what their gripe was with what the disciples were doing. Gripe number 1 is that unqualified people are speaking, and these barely literate Galileans that would be equated with hillbillies or hicks from out in the sticks have no right to roll into the headquarters of the religion, the intellectual center of Judaism, and hold themselves out as people who would have authority to say anything useful. And on paper, academically, I suppose the Sadducees have a point. But there are such a thing as qualifications that can trump on-paper academic credentials. For example, let's say you hung around with a guy who claimed to be the Son of God and physically rose from the dead and physically ascended to the right hand of the Maker of all things. Well, if you knew him personally and he gave you a job and called you by name and told you to do it, that would give you some credibility. Another thing that might give you credibility was if you were able to participate in miracles where people's busted up, broken, crippled legs suddenly reassembled and formed into something that worked. That gives you credibility. Another thing that might give you credibility would be the fact that you have thousands of followers who've joined up with your movement in just the last few days. And even if none of those things had occurred, human beings are still free. They're free to listen to who they want. They're free to think the way they want. And if somebody has an idea and a bunch of people just want to listen, even if you think the idea is stupid, they should be allowed to listen. Well, the Sadducees weren't into all of that libertarian nonsense. So gripe number 1 is we think you're too dumb to be teaching. Gripe number 2 is they really didn't like the part of what was being preached was resurrection from the dead. Now, I mentioned that the Sadducees were a liberal sect. That is, they didn't believe in some of these supernatural elements, and they particularly did not believe in the whole resurrection of the dead thing. So the fact that a big claim to fame of Jesus and his followers was that the Christ was raised from the dead, that doesn't have a lot of currency with people who reject the notion of resurrection. In fact, they kind of made a mockery of the idea of resurrection around Luke chapter 20, it's somewhere in there, when they got into it with Jesus with a series of questions, and they tried to trap him with a question about the resurrection of the dead and who will be married to whom after people get resurrected. They're trying to point out the absurdity of the whole thing. Well, they haven't changed in just a few weeks, and so to them, people talking about this is, eye-rollingly stupid. They would view this as a dumb superstition that only the simplest, most gullible religious fools would ever buy into. So it's not just that they don't like teaching about the resurrection, it's also that they're above it, and they don't like these unqualified people coming in and stirring up the masses with all these promises about things that the Sadducees have investigated and thoroughly debunked. Verse 3, they seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day. Maybe I read that a little bit too casually, but if you were drinking something, you should have done a spit take over that. Seriously, you arrested people and put them in jail overnight because they said some stuff religiously that you disagreed with? And to be clear, the Sadducees aren't even the only ruling party. They're a political party, not the government. They're just part of the government. And the other half of the government doesn't even agree with this. So apparently Peter and John have thought the unforgivable thing to think and had a conversation about this unforgivable thing. And as a result, they need to be deprived of basic human liberty for the night to teach them a lesson. So they ruin the event. There's this beautiful thing going on, and they bust it up with a weird, clumsy, awkward arrest over nothing. Let's see how effective that was. Verse 4, but many who heard the message believed, and the number of men grew to about 5,000. If you're a Sadducee fan, I would grade this operation go arrest some people for doing something good an F-. You'll also notice that Luke is counting this the way it was most common to count in the classical world, which is to count in terms of men, heads of households. He says about 5,000 men is what we're talking about. We're not even talking about women and children here. So the number of people following Christ at this point is a lot. 22 verses is manageable if you're talking to a group and you got an hour's worth of time. The 10-minute Bible hour format maybe doesn't totally lend itself to that. So we're going to hit pause there. I'm going to cut this thing in half. You know the drill. If you want to pick up the next part, you can click the little thought bubble or follow links elsewhere. I'll have the next part up right away. My name is Matt Whitman. This has been the 10-minute Bible hour. Plenty more to come.